She was only 22 and had recently starred in one of the highest-grossing cult classics of the 1980s. This week's I Remember When True Crime Edition is about Dominique Dunne. Just a quick warning, we're going to discuss domestic violence, self-harm, and life-taking. If you're unable to handle that right now, please feel free to skip this one, and I'll see you in the next one. There's also a lot to this case, and there are many documentaries and articles that you can reference to supplement this video. Dominique Ellen Dunne was born on November 23, 1959 in Santa Monica, California. She was one of 5 children born to mother Ellen, known as Lenny, and father Dominic, known as Nick, a well-known producer. She had 2 brothers, Griffin and Alexander, and 2 sisters who passed away in infancy. Dominique was Joan Didion's niece. Nick's brother John had married Joan in 1964. Joan's The Year of Magical Thinking was an account of the year after John passed in 2003. Lenny and Nick divorced in 1965, most likely due in part to the fact that Nick was gay. It was a secret that he would only entrust with Dominique, who would eventually play matchmaker, setting her father up with her close friend, artist Norman Carby. Dominique's brother Griffin wouldn't meet Carby until his father was in his 80s. Initially dabbling in theater, Dominique took her first role in the 1979 made-for-TV film Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker. She would continue to land guest roles on series like Breaking Away and Family into the 80s. Around this time, Dominique moved into a new home with her mom, one that would accommodate Lenny's multiple sclerosis. When she wasn't on set, Dominique took in stray pets, took acting classes, went horseback riding, and had started a weekly tradition called the Friday Afternoon Club, where she would gather her friends after acting classes. One member happened to be a young George Clooney. But it was in 1981 that everything would really start to change for her. She had gone to lunch one day with her Uncle John and Aunt Joan at Ma Maison in Hollywood, which is where she met chef John Sweeney. It was also the year that she would land one of her biggest roles and make her feature film debut as Dana Freeling in Poltergeist. And yes, I know Poltergeist was plagued with issues and is said to be cursed. We can talk about that another time, maybe in October. It was after only a few months of dating that Dominique and Sweeney would move in together into a 1-bedroom house on Rangeley Avenue in West Hollywood. But as Dominique's career grew, so did those of her friends, and the Friday Afternoon Club meant less and less. The insecure Sweeney felt like a failure compared to Dominique and her friends, never mind the fact that Ma Maison had menus designed by David Hockney and a long list of celebrity clientele. He took his insecurity out on Dominique, becoming possessive and violent. But still, Dominique was protective of him, and they continued to build a life together, which included taking a trip to New York to meet the men in Dominique's family. Nick, Griffin, Alex, Dominique, and Sweeney had gathered to watch an episode of Fame that Dominique had guest starred in on one night before heading out to dinner. Her brothers teased her about marriage, and she said that she wasn't going to get married, and they knew that she meant it. Griffin would later say that Dominique was born knowing who she was and what she wanted. Nick called Lenny that night and told her that Sweeney was much more in love with their daughter than she was with him. Lenny agreed. While Sweeney appeared devoted to his daughter, there was something about him that felt off to Nick. He would find out the next morning that his instincts were right. After he had left the kids to their own devices the night before, they had headed to PJ Clark's, a Manhattan restaurant and bar. Alex told his father that while Sweeney had been in the restroom, a fan had approached Dominique and chatted with her about Poltergeist. It was a harmless interaction, but when Sweeney returned to the table, he was enraged. He picked the man up and shook him. Alex told his father that Sweeney was scary. The next day, Nick had lunch plans with Dominique and Sweeney. While he was running a few minutes late himself, they were late to the point where he thought he had gotten the time wrong. When they finally arrived, he noted that Dominique looked lovely in her starched white dress, but it was evident she had been crying. The air between the two was tense. He found Sweeney difficult to talk to and said that it occurred to him that Dominique might have difficulty extricating herself from such a person, but he did not pursue the thought. That 4th of July, they dined at the River Cafe. Sweeney told Nick he intended to leave Ma Maison and had backing to open his own restaurant on Melrose Place. Dominique was also doing quite well. She was lined up to appear in the Poltergeist sequels and was working on the new miniseries V. But things at home were not good. Dominique had presented Sweeney with a world he could have only dreamed of, which meant that she could easily take it away. Born in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, Sweeney's upbringing was a stark contrast to Dominique's. He grew up poor. His father was an alcoholic who beat Sweeney's mother. Eventually, he found a way to leave that world behind when he started taking culinary classes at a community college. At the age of 20, he boarded a bus and headed for West Hollywood. There he got a job at an LA restaurant called Piccolo's, before being hired as chef's assistant at Ma Maison a year later. After 2 years of working doubles, Sweeney headed to the French Riviera to expand his craft. Upon his return, he became chef's assistant to Ma Maison's head chef, Wolfgang Puck. After Wolfgang left to start Spago and a fleet of airport pizzerias, Sweeney took over the Mum Maison kitchen until a French master chef could be hired. Where Mum Maison gave Sweeney glimpses into the life he desired, Dominique gave him full access. But with the glitz of Hollywood came the dread that Dominique would leave him and he would lose entry to that life. Which is why, as time went on, Sweeney became more and more controlling. He would show up to set, attend her acting classes, and was jealous over the mere thought that she might have a love scene with other actors. He even accused her of having abortions that she had never had. The more he pushed, the more Dominique withdrew, and the more he feared she would leave him, making him more aggressive and violent. In one letter she had written him that, when unsent, Dominique penned, "Don't live for me, live for yourself. You do not love me. You are obsessed with me. The person you think you love is not me at all. It is someone you have made up in your head. I think we only fight when images of me fade away and you are faced with the real me. The only man I am interested in is you, but we are not compatible. When we are good, we are great, but when we are bad, we are horrendous. The bad outweighs the good. The whole thing has made me realize how scared I am of you." And she had good reason to be afraid. On August 27, 1982, during one of their fights, Sweeney grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back so violently that he ripped handfuls of her hair out of her head. She ran to her mother's house in fear, only for Sweeney to appear later, banging on the doors and windows, yelling to let him in. Lenny threatened to call the police, and Sweeney finally went home. Dominique stayed with her mother for a few days before returning back to her shared home with Sweeney. A month later, the pair fought again. It was shortly after 3 a.m. that a friend who happened to be sleeping over at their house heard loud gagging noises, stating it was the worst sound she had ever heard. Dominique ran to the friend's room, exclaiming that Sweeney had tried to kill her. He had grabbed her by the back of the neck, threw her on the floor, and attempted to strangle her. Sweeney denied the accusation and told Dominique to get back to bed. She managed to slip out of the bathroom window. When Sweeney heard the car start, he sprinted out of the house and flung himself on the front of the car. Dominique drove off with him, still on the car, but stopped so he could jump off before driving away. She had dark bruises around her neck for days. That event was the one that sealed it for Dominique. She had to leave. She hid out with friends, and at her mother's house, Sweeney called her friends, trying to find her. Eventually, she convinced him to move out of their home, and after he left, she changed the locks and moved back in. She called Nick, told him that Sweeney was out of the house, that he had never really loved her, that he was obsessed with her. On the night of October 30th, 1982, Dominique had been on the phone with a friend when the operator cut in with a call from Sweeney. She tried to get him off the phone, but then he appeared at her house 10 minutes later. Her V co-star David Packer was there that night to rehearse a scene when Dominique cracked the door for Sweeney, leaving the chain on. David asked her if she wanted him to leave, and she said no, that she'd talked to Sweeney out on the porch. It was soon after that David heard angry voices, then loud smacking sounds from Sweeney hitting the window ledge with his hand, before hearing 2 screams and a thud. David called the police, who said that it was out of their department's jurisdiction. Then David phoned a friend and left a harrowing voicemail. "If I die tonight, it was by John Sweeney," before going out the back door and finding Sweeney crouching in the bushes by the driveway. Sweeney told him to call the police. When they arrived, he said that he had taken the life of his girlfriend and then tried to take his own life. According to Sweeney, he and Dominique were reconciling. They had talked of children and marriage, but that night Dominique said that she didn't want to reconcile. He accused her of leading him on. He claimed she said, "Yes, I have been lying to you." That's when he exploded and lunged at her. He claimed that he had no memory of what happened until after he found himself on top of Dominique with his hands around her neck. He noticed she wasn't breathing. He tried to get her to walk, but she couldn't. He tried to do CPR, but she threw up. Then he threw up. Then he ran into the house and swallowed 2 bottles of pills before going back outside and laying down next to her. When officers arrived on the scene, they said that he was calm and collected, that he was more interested in what was going to happen to him than what was going on with Dominique. While in the back of the police car, he said, "I can't believe I did something that will put me behind bars forever. Man, I blew it. I killed her. I didn't think I choked her that hard. I just kept on choking her." Dominique was transported to Cedars-Sinai, but by the time she got there, her heart had stopped. She was put on life support. Nick got a phone call at 5 a.m. on Halloween morning. It was Detective Harold Johnston of the LA Homicide Bureau. He told him that Dominique was near death at Cedars. He'd been calling from Lenny's house. When Detective Johnson put her on the phone, the first thing she said to Nick was, "I need you." He asked what happened. "Sweeney," she said. Word of Dominique's condition spread quickly. Lenny, Nick, Griffin, and Alex were by her side for days until they made the decision to take her off of life support. Dominique Dunne passed away on November 4th, just 3.5 weeks before her 23rd birthday. Lenny requested that Dominique's organs be donated to the hospital. She saved 2 kidney patients and 1 person waiting for a heart in San Francisco. Her funeral was planned for November 6th at 11 a.m., but on November 5th, they discovered that a wedding had been planned for the same time. The groom found out by reading Dominique's obituary. They had to arrange for 12 ushers to notify people attending the funeral to come back an hour later, as it would have been too late to publish in the papers. And if that wasn't bad enough, the groom was a friend of John Sweeney's. Sweeney's trial started in August 1983 and was presided over by Judge Burton Katz. He had previously prosecuted the Manson family when he worked for the district attorney's office and was considered to be a theatrical character who really loved a case with media attention. There's so much that happened in this trial, but in sum, it was an absolute mess. The prosecution had called Sweeney's ex-girlfriend Lillian Pierce as a witness who testified to the fact that Sweeney had harmed her on 10 separate occasions. She had been hospitalized twice. He had collapsed her lung. He had broken her nose. He was highly abusive towards her. At one point during her testimony, an enraged Sweeney made a break for the rear door of the courtroom. While the rest of the courtroom saw how quick Sweeney was to anger, Judge Katz accepted his apology, noting that they knew what strain he was under. Judge Katz also threw out Lillian's testimony, saying it was prejudicial. Lenny had taken the stand and testified to the night Sweeney ripped chunks of Dominique's hair out of her head. The defense asked if she knew what they had been arguing about that night. She said she didn't know. He asked if she knew about the abortion. She didn't. Nick didn't. Dominique's closest friends didn't. They seemingly used Sweeney's imaginary abortion as justification for the beating. As if anything could justify 6'1" John Sweeney laying his hands on 5'1" Dominique Dunne. When Sweeney testified as to what happened the night that he took Dominique's life, investigators refuted him at every turn. He said he didn't choke her for that long. They believed that Sweeney had to have choked Dominique for at least 5 minutes. Her autopsy would confirm at least 3. They also found no evidence that he had taken any pills. But that didn't matter. The jury never got to hear the testimony from Lillian, which proved that Sweeney was a repeat violent offender. They found him guilty of voluntary manslaughter, which carried a maximum sentence of 6 years, along with a misdemeanor assault for the September incident. As Judge Katz thanked the jury, telling them that they had served justice well, Nick yelled, "Not for our family, Judge Katz." At Sweeney's November 7th sentencing, he was handed the full 6-year sentence along with 6 months for the misdemeanor. He also criticized the jury for their verdict, as it was obviously a life-taking, which they felt was a cheap shot that stemmed from the immense public criticism that he had felt after the trial. Nick had kept extensive notes throughout the trial and afterwards published an article about it in the March 1984 issue of Vanity Fair. I recommend reading it if you haven't. It's called Justice, a Father's Account of the Trial of His Daughter's Killer. It would lead to an extensive writing career for Vanity Fair, where he would cover high-interest cases like that of O.J. Simpson. Lenny founded Justice for Homicide Victims and was a huge victims' rights advocate. Sweeney was released after only serving 2.5 years of his sentence. Dominique's family would protest the restaurants he worked at, getting him fired repeatedly. He eventually moved out of LA. It said that Sweeney changed his name and moved to the Pacific Northwest, or maybe it was New Jersey. I've read both. It's also said that he's continued abusing his partners, with the 2000 complaint made against him that resulted in a restraining order. Alex struggled with his mental health for years and eventually learned how to live with the burden of his lonely secrets, according to Griffin. Griffin is a successful actor who you might know from such things as An American Werewolf in London, After Hours, and This Is Us. He also published a memoir titled The Friday Afternoon Club this year, which covers his life and the death of Dominique. Lenny succumbed to MS in 1997, and Nick passed away in 2009 from bladder cancer. Hopefully, wherever they are, they have been reunited with their 3 daughters.